Time in ancient Rome was not something people checked. It was not displayed, counted down, or consulted. It was not confirmed by looking at an object or comparing two moments. Instead, time was something people felt gradually as part of the environment they were already inside. There was no clear instant when the day officially began, no signal that marked a precise starting point. Morning did not arrive as a command or an announcement. It formed slowly, the same way light gathers at the edge of a room or warmth returns to stone after night. The day did not start at a moment. It accumulated. In this world, time did not exist as a separate layer placed on top of life. It was not abstracted into numbers or units. It lived inside physical change, light shifting across walls, air warming, hunger appearing and then easing, muscles loosening after rest, sound thickening and thinning, movement beginning without instruction. No one looked at time. They looked at the world. Time was not something external that had to be consulted. It was not an authority outside the body. It emerged through repeated signals that the body already knew how to interpret. When light reached a certain angle, when shade became necessary, when effort became easier or harder, when rest felt complete. Without a fixed grid to measure the day, the body did not become confused. It became attentive in a different way. Instead of aligning itself to numbers, it aligned itself to patterns, signals repeated often enough to become familiar. The same sequence unfolding again and again with small variations that did not disrupt the whole. The day did not divide itself into sharp segments. There was no clear boundary between beginning and continuation. What existed instead was a slow progression. Morning did not replace night. It emerged from it. Afternoon did not interrupt morning. It thickened it. Evening did not arrive suddenly. It softened what had already been happening. Time functioned as an environment rather than a schedule. Light was one of its most constant elements. Not as a measurement, but as a condition. Where light reached, activity followed. Where it withdrew, movement adjusted. No one needed to label this change. The body felt it immediately. Shadows lengthened, surfaces cooled, the angle of warmth shifted. These were not instructions. They were confirmations. Temperature played the same role. The day became heavier or lighter depending on heat. Effort adjusted accordingly. When the air grew dense, movement slowed. When it eased, energy returned. This was not managed consciously. It was felt directly. Time expressed itself through comfort and strain rather than through numbers. Hunger appeared without being scheduled. It did not arrive at a fixed hour. It surfaced gradually, depending on movement, effort, and what had come before. Eating responded to this signal rather than anticipating it. Food did not organize the day. It entered it when needed. Fatigue worked the same way. The body did not check whether it was late enough to rest. It noticed heaviness, a slowing of motion, a desire to sit rather than stand. Rest followed when the body asked for it, not when a marker allowed it. Sound participated in this system as well. The day became fuller acoustically as movement increased. It thinned as activity softened. Sound did not announce time. It reflected it. The ear did not listen for a signal to begin or end. It remained open, registering change without labeling it. Movement itself became a form of timekeeping. Tasks completed, paths walked, objects moved from one place to another. Each action left a subtle imprint. The body remembered how much had already happened, not through counting, but through sensation. Weight carried, heat accumulated, familiar fatigue. In this way, the day explained itself continuously. Without clocks, time was not something that needed to be interpreted. It was not something that required translation into meaning. It made itself known through the same channels the body already used to stay alive and oriented. There was no need to pause life in order to check time. Life was the reference. This created a relationship with time that was neither rushed nor vague. The absence of numbers did not produce uncertainty. It produced tolerance. Events did not need to align perfectly. Waiting did not feel like failure. Being early or late was rarely defined precisely enough to matter. The day was understood as a sequence of conditions rather than a series of deadlines. When one condition ended, another took its place, not because time advanced, but because the environment changed. Light shifted, bodies moved, needs emerged and dissolved. Nothing needed to be synchronized exactly for the day to function. This meant that time did not apply pressure. It did not push from behind or pull from ahead. There was no sense of falling behind or racing forward. The body moved within the day rather than against it. Repetition played an important role here. When the same patterns repeat often enough, precision becomes unnecessary. The body learns what comes next without needing confirmation. Morning leads into work. Work gives way to pause. Pause opens into further movement. Evening approaches as effort softens. Night arrives as attention releases. These transitions were not marked, they were felt. Because the day behaved predictably, it did not need to be measured. The absence of a fixed grid did not mean the absence of structure. It meant that structure lived inside experience rather than outside it. This is easy to misunderstand if we imagine time only as something that must be counted. But counting is not the same as knowing. In ancient Rome, knowing the day meant being inside it long enough to recognize its shape. The body did not need to be told what time it was. It recognized where it was within the day by how it felt, how the environment behaved, and how much had already unfolded. This allowed attention to remain outward rather than inward. There was no need to monitor progress constantly. The body did not have to ask whether it was doing the right thing at the right moment. It simply responded to what was present. In this way, time did not become an object of focus. It stayed in the background, shaping experience without demanding attention. The day did not feel fragmented. It felt continuous. This continuity mattered. When time does not fracture experience into units, the mind does not need to switch modes constantly. Awareness can remain broad. Movement can flow. Rest can arrive without negotiation. Living without clocks did not mean living without rhythm. It meant living inside rhythm rather than managing it. To understand time in ancient Rome, we don't begin with clocks or hours. We begin with the simple fact that the day explained itself. And the first way it did that was through how morning arrived. Instead, it emerged as a slow shift in conditions already present. Light changed first, not suddenly, but by degrees. Shadows softened. Stone surfaces began to release the cool they had gathered overnight. The world did not switch from night to day. It leaned gently in that direction. Light entered spaces differently depending on where one stood. In open courtyards, it arrived early, spreading across floors and walls without interruption. In narrow streets, it filtered in more slowly, slipping between buildings and touching stone in uneven patches. Inside rooms, it appeared last, reaching corners only after it had already moved through exterior spaces. This staggered arrival meant there was no single moment when morning could be said to have begun. It arrived in layers. Because of this, the body did not wait for confirmation that the day had started. There was no reference point that needed to be checked. Awareness adjusted naturally as light became present enough to support movement. Eyes opened when darkness was no longer complete. Muscles shifted when the air no longer held the same weight. The body did not decide to wake. It found itself awake. Movement often began before food. before planning, before any clear intention. Someone stepped into a courtyard. A door opened slightly to let air circulate. A person crossed a room to retrieve an object left where it had been placed the night before. These actions were not responses to time. They were responses to condition. Light allowed movement, so movement followed. Morning activity did not require preparation. There was no sense of being early or late in an abstract way. What mattered was whether something needed to be done and whether the environment allowed it to happen. Tasks did not wait for a starting hour. They emerged when circumstances aligned. Light, energy, and obligation converged naturally. Shadows played an important role in this process. Long shadows stretching across streets and walls did not indicate a time of day in numbers, but they provided orientation. They showed direction. They showed progression. A shadow falling across a doorway or retreating from a threshold told the body something about where the day was heading without translating that knowledge into units. Doors opened not because it was time to open them, but because light and activity had reached a point where interior and exterior needed to reconnect. The act of opening a door was not ceremonial, it was practical. Air needed to move, people needed to pass. Sound needed to flow. The opening itself was an extension of the morning rather than its marker. Footsteps appeared early, but without urgency. Someone crossing a street did not signal the start of commerce or labor. It signaled presence, life continuing. These early movements were sparse and uncoordinated. They did not form a rush. They formed a gradual thickening of activity, similar to how light gathered. Because there was no strict boundary between night and morning, the body did not experience a jolt when waking. There was no sudden demand to transition from rest to action. Sleep loosened gradually. Awareness widened slowly. The nervous system did not brace itself for engagement. It entered it gently. Morning did not require alignment across many people at once. Each body responded independently to the same environmental signals. Some moved earlier, others later. This difference did not create conflict or confusion. There was no shared expectation that everyone should be awake or active at the same moment. The absence of numerical time meant there was no concept of being behind schedule at dawn. No one measured the morning against a standard. What existed instead was a shared understanding of necessity. If something needed to happen early, it happened when light allowed it. If it could wait, it waited without tension. Food did not define the beginning of the day. Eating did not serve as a marker that separated sleep from activity. Movement came first. The body engaged with the environment before nourishment appeared. Hunger, when it emerged, did so quietly, without demanding immediate response. Food entered the morning when it fit naturally, not as a requirement. This sequence mattered. When movement precedes eating, the day does not feel framed by intake. It feels framed by presence. The body establishes itself in space before addressing its needs. Morning becomes something lived rather than something managed. Inside homes, the same gradualness applied. Light filtered through openings in ceilings or small windows, touching interior surfaces unevenly. Some areas brightened, while others remained dim. The house did not awaken all at once. It responded room by room, surface by surface. People adjusted their position rather than adjusting the environment. There was no switch to turn on, no action to perform in order to begin the day. One simply moved closer to light or into it when it became available. This lack of a clear starting point prevented urgency from taking hold. When there is no moment that must be met, there is no pressure to meet it. Morning could unfold without being chased. Obligations existed, but they were not bound to a minute. They were bound to conditions. A task required light. Another required others to be present. Another required the body to be rested enough to perform it. These requirements did not align perfectly every day, and that variability was expected. As a result, Morning did not feel fragile. It did not depend on precision. Small delays did not disrupt anything. There was no narrow window to miss. The body understood now not as a number but as a relationship. Now meant light has reached here. Now meant the air feels different. Now meant movement is easier than stillness. This sense of now was always relative, always embodied. As more people began to move, the environment responded without changing character. Sound thickened slightly, doors opened more often, footsteps overlapped. But nothing announced a transition. The city did not wake up. It continued. This continuity allowed the body to remain calm, even as activity increased. There was no sudden demand for attention, no instruction to hurry. The ear, the eye, and the body adjusted together. Morning was not a gate to pass through, it was a slope to walk along. Because there was no clock defining when morning officially ended, it blended into the rest of the day without resistance. Tasks begun early did not feel separate from those begun later. There was no sense of crossing into a new phase, only a deepening of what was already happening. This gradualness shaped the internal experience of time. The day felt spacious even when full. There was room to adjust, room to pause, room to respond rather than react. When the body does not have to align itself to a precise start, it does not tense in anticipation. It remains open, flexible, available, flexible. And so morning in ancient Rome did not arrive as a scheduled start. It arrived as a shift in light, a soft accumulation of conditions that invited movement without demanding it. The body did not need to ask what time it was. It already knew that the day had begun because it was already inside it. As morning settled into presence rather than beginning, work entered the day in the same way. It did not arrive as a block of time that needed to be filled. It appeared as a sequence of tasks that needed to be completed. One action led naturally to the next, not because a schedule demanded it, but because the previous action had reached its end. Time did not stand apart from work. It was contained within it. In this environment, work became the primary way the day was experienced, not as effort measured against a clock, but as motion unfolding through necessity. A task began when conditions allowed it and ended when it was finished. There was no external signal to stop. Completion itself marked the passage forward. For that reason, duration was rarely calculated. A task took as long as it took. This was not treated as inefficiency or delay. It was simply the nature of the work. Stone resisted at its own pace. Wood yielded according to its grain. Bodies tired gradually, not suddenly. The work adjusted to these realities rather than forcing them into fixed intervals. Progress was felt physically rather than counted mentally. Hands recognized when enough had been done. Muscles signaled when effort needed to pause. The eye judged completion not by numbers but by form. Something was ready, something was stable, something no longer required attention. This idea of enough mattered deeply. Work did not aim for optimization, it aimed for sufficiency. When a task reached the point where it served its purpose, it ended naturally. There was no need to continue simply because time remained, nor was there pressure to rush simply because time might be limited. Short pauses appeared without ceremony. A person rested briefly not because a break was scheduled, but because the body required it. These pauses were not separate from work. They were part of its rhythm. Movement slowed, breathing deepened. Then work resumed when readiness returned. Because time was not divided into units, pauses did not feel like interruptions. They felt like adjustments. Work flowed around them without losing coherence. Nothing needed to be recalibrated. One task finishing did not signal urgency to begin the next. It created space. In that space, the next action emerged when it was clear what needed to be done. The day advanced through sequence rather than through acceleration. This sequencing shaped attention. When work is experienced as a series of complete actions, the mind does not need to track progress abstractly. It stays with what is present. Awareness remains local rather than projected forward. There was no constant question of how long something would take. That question only matters when time exists as a container. Here, time was embedded in the task itself. The task defined its own duration. Because of this, the day did not feel narrowed. Even when many tasks needed to be completed, they did not pile up mentally. Each one occupied its own space. When it ended, it released attention fully before the next began. Repetition played a role, but not in an optimized sense. Tasks repeated because they were necessary, not because repetition increased efficiency. Familiarity reduced friction, but it did not accelerate time. It made effort feel steadier. The absence of precise measurement meant that variation was expected. The same task might take longer one day and less time another. This difference did not require explanation. It was absorbed naturally. Work did not compete with time. It collaborated with it. Because there was no constant reference to a clock, effort did not feel like something being spent against a diminishing resource. Energy was managed by sensation rather than calculation. When strength remained, work continued. When it faded, work adjusted. This relationship prevented urgency from becoming the default state. Without a deadline approaching minute by minute, there was no pressure to compress action. Movement could remain deliberate. Even when work was demanding, it did not feel rushed. Intensity existed without haste. This distinction mattered. The body could exert itself fully without being pulled forward unnaturally. Sound accompanied work without signaling progress. A task did not become louder as it advanced. It did not grow quieter as it neared completion. Sound remained consistent, reinforcing the sense that work was unfolding rather than racing. Because work measured the day did not need to be measured separately. Morning flowed into sustained activity without marking a boundary. There was no moment when one checked whether the morning was ending or the afternoon beginning. The work itself provided orientation. When light shifted, work adjusted. Some tasks became easier, others became less practical. The sequence adapted without resistance. No recalculation was required. This adaptability created resilience. When conditions changed, the structure of the day did not collapse. It reshaped itself quietly around necessity. Work also created a natural sense of progression. Not because hours passed, but because outcomes accumulated. Something that had not existed now did. Something incomplete became whole. These changes marked the day more clearly than numbers ever could. Because the mind tracked completion rather than duration, satisfaction was tied to outcome, not to efficiency. Finishing something brought closure, starting something else brought focus. There was no lingering sense of being behind or ahead. This prevented fragmentation. The day did not break into segments that needed to be managed. It remained whole. As tasks accumulated, the body recognized when enough had been done for the moment. Fatigue was not interpreted as failure, it was information. Work paused or shifted accordingly. This responsiveness allowed endurance without burnout. Effort expanded and contracted naturally. The body was not pushed beyond what it could sustain. Importantly, this did not mean that work lacked structure. It had structure, but that structure was internal rather than imposed. Sequence replaced schedule. Completion replaced duration. Because of this, time remained a background condition. It shaped experience without becoming an object of attention. The day moved forward because work moved forward. When work slowed later in the day, time did not suddenly change character. It softened gradually, just as it had thickened earlier. There was no sharp transition that required acknowledgement. The end of work did not need to be announced. It arrived when tasks no longer called for attention, when light no longer supported certain actions, when the body shifted naturally toward rest. This ending did not feel like stopping on command. It felt like reaching a point of sufficiency. And so in ancient Rome, time was not measured by minutes. It was measured by what had been done, what still needed doing, and what could wait. Work did not fill time. It revealed it. When work revealed time through completion rather than duration, the sun provided the wider orientation that held the day together. It did not divide hours or announce precise moments. It offered direction. Its movement across walls, streets, and open spaces shaped behavior without ever becoming a number that needed to be consulted. People did not ask what time it was by looking at the sun. They understood where they were in the day by how the sun behaved around them. Light entered the city unevenly. It reached courtyards before streets, touched upper walls before lower ones, and moved across interior spaces in slow, predictable arcs. This movement was not read as a measurement. It was read as a condition. A space became usable, then uncomfortable, then quiet again, not because a certain hour had arrived, but because the quality of light had changed. The sun's position altered temperature more clearly than it marked time. As light strengthened, stone warmed. Surfaces that had felt cool earlier in the day began to hold heat. Air thickened slightly. Movement adjusted without instruction. Bodies did not need to be told that the day was advancing. They felt it. As shadows shortened, certain tasks became less appealing. Work that required exposure slowed or paused, not because a midday hour had been reached, but because heat made effort less sustainable. The environment guided behavior more effectively than any signal could have. This moment, what we might later label as midday, was experienced as a sensation rather than a point. It arrived gradually, announced by discomfort rather than clarity. Light overhead felt different from light at an angle. Shadows offered less relief. Stone reflected warmth back into the body. These changes were unmistakable, even without being named. The city responded collectively without coordination. Movement shifted toward shade. Activity withdrew slightly from open streets and gathered near walls, arcades, and interiors. The rhythm of the day did not break. It adjusted its posture. Importantly, this adjustment did not feel like interruption. It felt like continuation under different conditions. Tasks were not abandoned, they were rearranged. What could be done indoors was done there. What required less exertion filled the warmer hours. Because the sun offered direction rather than precision, the day did not fracture into segments that needed to be obeyed. There was no pressure to align action with a fixed moment. Instead, action aligned with comfort, visibility, and endurance. This made time flexible without making it vague. People knew roughly where they were in the day, but they did not experience that knowledge as a constraint. It did not demand acceleration or delay, it simply informed choice. The absence of exactness reduced tension. When there is no precise moment to hit, there is no risk of missing it. The body remains responsive rather than anxious. Movement adapts continuously rather than reacting suddenly. Light also shaped interior life. As the sun moved higher, interior spaces brightened indirectly, then dimmed again as the angle changed. This subtle shift influenced where people sat, stood, or rested. A spot that had been pleasant earlier became too warm. Another, previously cool, became comfortable. These adjustments happened without discussion. No one announced that it was time to move. The body noticed, and movement followed. In this way, the sun structured the day without organizing it. It provided cues without commands. Its presence was constant, but its influence changed slowly enough to be absorbed rather than resisted. When clouds passed or seasons shifted, the day responded differently but still without precision. A cooler day allowed longer activity in open spaces. A hotter one compressed effort into narrower windows. These variations were expected. They did not disrupt the sense of continuity. Because the sun was not treated as a clock, it did not create deadlines, it created gradients. The day moved through these gradients naturally, guided by sensation rather than calculation. This relationship prevented the experience of being late or early in a strict sense. One could be early relative to light or late relative to heat, but these were felt states, not judgments. They did not carry urgency or failure. The sun also did not dictate a universal rhythm. Different parts of the city experienced it differently. Narrow streets held shade longer, open courtyards filled with light sooner. Interiors lagged behind exteriors. The day did not advance everywhere at once. This unevenness allowed variety without chaos. People adjusted locally rather than collectively. There was no single moment when everything changed. As the sun began its descent, the shift was felt again before it was seen. Heat softened. Shadows lengthened slightly, surfaces released warmth. The body recognized this easing almost immediately. Movement expanded again. Tasks that had been postponed resumed. Activity did not surge. It returned calmly, filling the spaces that had emptied earlier. Once again, this change did not feel like a transition between blocks of time. It felt like the environment becoming more permissive. The day opened itself slightly wider. Throughout all of this, the sun did not need to be watched. Its influence was everywhere, making observation unnecessary. People lived inside its effects rather than tracking its position. As a result, attention remained outward. The body oriented itself toward conditions rather than abstractions. Time stayed embedded in the world rather than pulled into the mind. This is why midday did not stand out as a dramatic turning point. It was simply the moment when certain things became harder and others became easier. When effort adjusted accordingly, the day continued. The sun did not tell people what to do. It made certain actions feel right and others less so. Choice followed comfort, visibility, and endurance. This allowed the day to remain humane. No one was asked to push against the environment unnecessarily. The world set limits gently, and behavior adapted without conflict. As work and movement responded to light and heat, the sense of time remained continuous. There was no moment when one needed to ask where the day had gone. It was always present, unfolding visibly. The sun, in this sense, acted less like a ruler and more like a guide. It did not measure, it oriented. It did not divide, it shaped. Because the sun offered direction rather than numbers, time remained something lived rather than managed. The day explained itself through light, warmth, and shadow, and the body listened without effort. And so, just as work revealed time through completion, the sun revealed it through sensation. Together they created a day that moved forward without being counted, steady, legible, and responsive to the world as it was. As the sun shaped time through light and heat outdoors, the house shaped time through repetition and containment. Crossing the threshold into an interior space did not remove time from experience. It changed how time was felt. Indoors, the day did not announce itself through shifting brightness or rising temperature. It revealed itself quietly through the rhythm of small actions repeated within a stable environment. The Roman house did not isolate its inhabitants from the day. It filtered the day. Light entered indirectly, softened by walls, openings, and shaded spaces. Heat arrived later and left more slowly. Sound was absorbed rather than amplified. In this softened environment, time did not need to be tracked. It became less noticeable precisely because conditions changed more slowly. Inside the house, the day lost its sharp edges. Movements became smaller. Tasks required less urgency. The body adjusted its pace without instruction. There was no need to ask how much time had passed. What mattered was what was happening now, within reach, within the familiar boundaries of the space. Domestic activities did not divide the day into segments. They flowed into one another, sitting, standing, preparing, repairing, waiting. These actions did not signal beginnings or endings. They filled space rather than time. One action concluded when it no longer required attention, and another took its place naturally. Because interior spaces were simple and consistent, they did not demand adaptation. The floor remained stone, the walls remained cool. Objects stayed where they were placed or moved slightly and then settled again. Nothing in the environment insisted on change. This constancy allowed time to recede into the background. Light inside the house did not function as a clock. It shifted subtly, often without being noticed. A corner brightened, then dimmed. A surface caught light briefly, then released it. These changes were too gradual to mark moments. They served only to confirm continuity. The absence of strong contrast mattered. When conditions remain relatively stable, the mind does not search for markers. There is no need to note transitions because none are emphasized. Time does not feel like it is passing. It feels like it is holding. Domestic routines reinforced this effect. Many activities inside the home were repetitive by nature. The same motions were performed day after day, often at different points in the day, without being tied to a specific moment. These repetitions did not measure time, they dissolved it. Preparing simple food, arranging objects, cleaning a surface, mending something worn. These tasks had no ideal duration. They were done until they were done. If they took longer, nothing was lost. If they were interrupted, they could resume later without consequence. Because of this, time inside the house was not scarce. It did not feel as though it needed to be used efficiently. It simply existed as the space in which actions occurred. The body moved through it without resistance. The house also supported pauses without defining them. Rest did not require a scheduled break. Sitting down did not need justification. Standing still was not unproductive. Pauses appeared when the body needed them and ended when movement returned naturally. This flexibility prevented the experience of waiting for time to pass. Indoors, there was little sense of anticipation tied to a future moment. Attention remained anchored in the present activity, however small. The filtered light contributed to this anchoring. Without strong visual cues, the body relied more on internal signals: fatigue, comfort, hunger, ease. These signals were not precise, but they were sufficient. They guided behavior gently. Temperature inside the house changed slowly, often lagging behind the outdoors. This delay smoothed transitions. The body was not forced to adapt quickly. It remained within a narrow range of sensation, which reduced awareness of time passing. Objects inside the house did not mark time either. There were no devices that counted or chimed, no surfaces that reflected progress. Objects were used, set down, and reused. Their presence did not change with the hour. Because the environment did not reflect time back to the inhabitants, attention was not pulled toward it. The mind did not check in with the day constantly. It stayed with the task, the space, the body. In this way, the house softened the day much as it softened sound. It reduced intensity without removing presence. It did not stop time. It made time less demanding. The predictability of the interior space was key. When nothing changes abruptly, there is no need to monitor. The body does not brace for transitions. It remains relaxed, moving from one action to the next without tension. Even when multiple people shared the space, time did not become fragmented. Activities overlapped quietly. Someone rested while another worked. Someone moved while another remained still. These differences did not create conflict because they were not synchronized to a shared schedule. The house did not require coordination through time. It allowed coexistence through space. This reduced the need for temporal agreement. People did not need to align their actions precisely. They simply occupied the same environment. As afternoon moved toward evening, the interior changed subtly again. Light thinned further, the air cooled slightly. Movement slowed. None of this required acknowledgement. The house absorbed these changes and presented them gently. This absorption prevented the sense of a day ending suddenly. There was no interior signal that announced a new phase. The day continued inward, becoming quieter without being divided. Because time inside the house was experienced through repetition rather than precision, memory did not organize itself around moments. Days were not recalled by what happened at a certain hour, but by what was done and how it felt. This way of living did not require awareness of time as a separate concept. Time was inseparable from action and sensation. It did not stand apart, it was embedded. When the environment remains constant enough, the need for markers disappears. The house provided that constancy. It held the day in place long enough for attention to settle. And so, while the sun oriented the day from outside, the house contained it from within. Together they allowed time to be lived without being counted, experienced through rhythm, repetition, and presence rather than precision or measure. Because time inside the house did not demand measurement, it also did not turn waiting into a problem. When time is not divided into counted units, waiting does not appear as a gap. It appears as part of the same fabric as action. One moment does not need to justify itself by leading efficiently to the next. It simply exists. In ancient Rome, waiting was not an interruption of life. It was one of its most common conditions. People waited for others to arrive, for water to be drawn, for food to warm, for materials to be delivered, for light to shift, for heat to soften, for the body to feel ready to move again. None of this waiting felt exceptional. It was expected because nothing was designed to happen instantly. Without clocks, waiting did not come with a countdown. There was no sense of time slipping away invisibly in the background. Nothing was being lost because nothing was being tracked. The body was not aware of minutes passing, only of conditions changing slowly. Waiting for water, for example, was not idle. Water did not arrive on demand. It required movement, filling, carrying, settling. Sometimes it took longer, sometimes it arrived sooner. In between, the body adjusted. It did not tense. It did not anticipate a precise moment of completion. It simply remained present. Fire worked the same way. Fire could not be rushed safely. It needed time to establish itself, to heat slowly, to transform materials at its own pace. Waiting near fire was common, watching it change, adjusting fuel, sitting nearby while it did its work. This waiting was not empty. It was part of the process. When food was prepared, it did not demand constant attention. Long stretches passed where nothing needed to be done. The body waited, but it did not feel delayed. It felt aligned with the pace of the task. Waiting was simply what the task required. People waited for one another constantly. Movement depended on others finishing what they were doing, arriving from elsewhere, completing their own sequences. This waiting did not feel like inconvenience. It was assumed. The body did not prepare itself to resume at a precise moment. It remained open. Because there was no exact time to meet, there was no exact time to miss. Later did not mean delayed. It meant not now. It was elastic, shaped by circumstance rather than schedule. This elasticity changed how the body experienced pause. Without a numeric deadline, waiting did not compress attention. It did not pull awareness forward anxiously. The body remained where it was. Waiting often became rest without being labeled as such. Standing quietly, sitting nearby, leaning against a surface, breathing, slowing without instruction. These moments did not require permission. They were simply how the body behaved when nothing needed immediate action. The absence of clocks removed pressure from these pauses. There was no internal voice measuring how long one had been inactive, no comparison to an expected duration. Waiting did not need to be justified as productive or necessary. It simply occurred. This is where the experience becomes especially gentle. When waiting does not feel like delay, the body does not tighten around it. Muscles remain loose, breath stays even, the nervous system does not escalate. When time is counted, waiting often creates tension because it exists in contrast to an expected pace. When time is not counted, waiting exists on the same level as movement. People waited for shade to appear in the right place. They waited for heat to lessen. They waited for light to change angle. These waits were built into the day. They were not obstacles to be overcome. Waiting was also social. One person paused while another finished. One action slowed because another was incomplete. This did not feel inefficient. It felt cooperative. Life moved at the pace of its slowest necessary element. Because waiting was common, it did not stand out. It did not interrupt the sense of continuity. The day did not fracture into action versus inaction. It remained whole. Even frustration, when it occurred, did not attach itself to time. It attached itself to conditions, heat, discomfort, scarcity, not to waiting itself. Time was not blamed. It was not felt as pressure. The body learned early that many things could not be forced. It learned to occupy the space between beginning and completion without distress. Waiting became a posture rather than a problem. This posture was physical as much as mental. Weight shifted, hands rested, eyes wandered, attention softened. The body did not lean forward into the future. It stayed in place. Because nothing was expected at a precise moment, there was no need to monitor progress constantly. The mind did not ask, "Is it time yet?" That question had no meaning. Instead, the body asked, "Is it ready?" or "Has it changed?" These questions did not carry urgency. When something was ready, it revealed itself naturally. Water was full. Food was warmed. Someone arrived. Light shifted. The moment announced itself through sensation, not through measurement. This kind of waiting trained patience without effort. Patience did not need to be practiced consciously. It emerged because the environment offered no alternative. There was nothing to count, nothing to rush toward. Importantly, this did not feel passive. Waiting was not inactivity imposed from outside. It was participation in a slower process. The body remained involved even while still. Waiting also blended easily into other actions. A person might wait while adjusting something nearby, while observing, while preparing for what would come next. The boundary between waiting and doing was porous. In practice, waiting rarely felt empty. It was filled with small movements, minor adjustments, quiet awareness. The body did not experience a void, it experienced continuation. As evening approached, waiting became even more prominent. The body waited for darkness to deepen, for activity to thin, for rest to feel appropriate. None of this required tracking. It unfolded on its own. Waiting for night did not feel like postponement. It felt like easing. The body slowed as the environment slowed. Nothing needed to be forced. This is where waiting becomes especially compatible with rest. When waiting does not signal delay, it does not stimulate alertness. It allows attention to loosen rather than tighten. The absence of numeric deadlines meant that nothing was late. Nothing was early. Events arrived when conditions aligned. This alignment felt sufficient, not deficient. Because waiting was normal, it did not require distraction. There was no need to fill it with activity to make it tolerable. The body could remain still without feeling incomplete. This stillness supported recovery. Muscles released, breath deepened. Thought wandered without pressure. Waiting became a form of rest without intention. In this way, Living without clocks reshaped the emotional texture of time itself. Time did not threaten, it did not pursue, it did not slip away unseen, it simply unfolded. Waiting was not something to endure, it was something to inhabit. And so, when we look closely at waiting in ancient Rome, we do not see wasted time. We see time behaving as it naturally does when it is not divided, monitored, or pursued. Waiting did not oppose life. It was one of its most stable forms, quiet, elastic, and deeply compatible with rest. Because waiting did not divide the day into productive and unproductive stretches, it also removed the need for strict alignment between people. When time is not counted, it does not need to be matched. Individuals can move through the day together without moving in lockstep. Shared life does not require shared schedules. In ancient Rome, people lived alongside one another without needing to occupy the same moment in the same way. One person might be eating while another was still working. Someone else might be resting nearby. These differences did not create friction. They were expected. The day was not a single thread that everyone had to follow simultaneously. It was a field of overlapping rhythms. Because there were no precise start times, there were no precise expectations of alignment. A task did not need to begin when everyone was ready. It began when the conditions were right, others joined when it made sense for them. This flexibility allowed shared spaces to remain calm rather than coordinated. Meals illustrate this clearly. Eating was not a synchronized event that gathered everyone at once. People ate when food was available and when hunger appeared. Someone might eat earlier, someone else later. This did not feel disordered, it felt natural. Food did not mark time, it responded to it. Work functioned the same way. Not everyone worked on the same task or at the same moment. Some activities required early attention, others waited. Some people rested while others continued. The day absorbed these differences without needing to resolve them into a single pattern. Because there was no master schedule, there was no sense of falling behind. No one was off time relative to others. Each person moved through the day according to their own sequence, guided by obligation, energy, and circumstance, rather than by alignment. This allowed shared spaces to remain fluid. A courtyard might contain people doing different things at once, without conflict. One person passed through, another paused, another remained still. These actions did not need to be synchronized to coexist. Coordination still occurred, but it was contextual rather than temporal. People met when paths crossed, when tasks overlapped, when presence aligned naturally. There was no need to agree on a specific moment in advance. The environment handled that work. This kind of coordination required attention to context rather than to time. People noticed who was present, who was available, who had finished something, who was waiting. Decisions were made based on what was visible rather than what was scheduled. Because of this, shared life felt responsive rather than rigid. Plans could adjust without stress. If someone was not ready, others adapted. Nothing broke. Nothing needed to be recalculated. The absence of synchronization reduced pressure on social interaction. One did not need to arrive on time to be accepted. Arrival itself was the event. Presence mattered more than punctuality. This shaped relationships subtly. Interaction did not feel like an interruption to someone else's schedule. It felt like a natural overlap. People engaged when their rhythms crossed, not because a clock demanded it. Even large households operated this way. Not everyone rose at the same moment. Not everyone rested together. The house absorbed these differences. Sound, movement, and activity layered rather than clashed. Because activities were not tightly scheduled, they did not compete. One person's rest did not delay another's work. One person's work did not intrude upon another's pause. The environment allowed coexistence without negotiation. This coexistence relied on tolerance rather than control. When time is not scarce, difference does not feel threatening. There is room for variation, room for delay, room for early or late without consequence. Children moved through this environment freely. They did not need to align themselves with adult schedules constantly. Their activity rose and fell according to energy rather than instruction. Adults adapted around them without frustration. Older individuals rested when needed, and they did not need to match the pace of others. Shared life did not require uniform output, it required presence. This lack of synchronization also meant that moments of solitude occurred naturally within shared space. One could be alone without being separate. Quiet did not require withdrawal, it appeared when overlap thinned. Because time was not divided sharply, people did not need to protect their moments aggressively. There was no fear of interruption stealing something limited. Interaction could happen without loss. This reduced defensiveness. The body did not brace itself against intrusion. It remained open to adjustment. Shared time in this sense was not about simultaneous action. It was about mutual accommodation. People moved around one another rather than in formation. Even when coordination was necessary, lifting something together, preparing a shared task, it emerged from readiness rather than from timing. People joined when they arrived. The action waited if needed. No one was late. This waiting did not feel inefficient. It felt appropriate. The action began when conditions aligned, not when a signal demanded it. As a result, collective effort felt grounded. It did not rush ahead of capacity. It did not force participation before readiness. Shared work respected individual rhythms. This respect extended into rest. Not everyone slept at the same moment. Some lay down earlier, others later. The house accommodated this without disturbance. Sound softened. Movement adjusted. Night did not require synchronization either. Rest unfolded individually within a shared environment. The absence of precise bedtime removed pressure. Sleep arrived when the body was ready. This individual arrival did not fragment the household. It deepened familiarity. Everyone learned the rhythms of others without needing to control them. Because there was no shared schedule to maintain, there was also no shared anxiety about disruption. One person waking did not threaten another's rest. Sound had always been present. Movement did not break a fragile condition. Shared time without synchronization allowed life to remain layered rather than compressed. People did not need to fit themselves into narrow windows. They expanded into the day at different points. This layering created resilience. When one rhythm slowed, another continued. The day did not stop. It adjusted. Importantly, this did not create chaos, it created flexibility. The absence of synchronization did not remove order, it replaced rigid order with contextual order. Contextual order responds to what is happening rather than to what should be happening. It adapts moment by moment. It does not require enforcement. Because of this, shared life could absorb change easily. A delay did not cascade. A pause did not derail plans. Everything existed within a wider tolerance. This tolerance supported calm. The nervous system did not remain alert to coordination failures. There were none to fear. Shared time was not something to manage. It was something to inhabit together, loosely, without needing constant alignment. And so in ancient Rome, people lived together without needing the same schedule. They shared space, not hours. They coordinated through presence, not through clocks. Life moved forward not because everyone moved at once, but because everyone was allowed to move when it fit. This is how shared time remained gentle, not synchronized but compatible, not precise but sufficient. And because of that, it remained deeply livable, quietly supporting both connection and rest without ever needing to be counted. Because shared life did not require synchronization, Evening did not need to arrive all at once. There was no collective moment when the day officially ended. No signal that declared work finished and rest begun. Evening emerged gradually through many small softenings rather than a single change. Effort began to loosen before activity stopped. Movements lost urgency. Tasks were completed without replacement. The body adjusted first, long before the environment followed. This is where evening truly began, not at a number, but at the moment when effort no longer pushed forward. Light played an essential role in this transition, but not as a marker. It did not announce evening, it invited it. Shadows lengthened slowly. Brightness thinned, surfaces reflected less sharply. These changes did not demand response, they suggested it. As light softened, sound shifted as well, not dramatically and not immediately. The city did not fall quiet, it relaxed. Certain sounds faded because the actions that produced them were no longer necessary. Others remained, but changed in character. Movement became slower, contact gentler. Space widened acoustically. The body responded without instruction. Muscles released tension accumulated through the day. Breathing deepened slightly. Posture adjusted. These changes were not decisions, they were responses to a gradual easing of demand. Objects were gathered, not because a schedule required it, but because use had ended. Tools were set aside, surfaces were cleared, open spaces narrowed. This was not a formal closing, it was a sequence of completions. Doors closed where light no longer supported activity. Spaces that had been active during the day withdrew naturally. Others became more central. The city did not switch from one mode to another. It redistributed attention. This redistribution happened unevenly. Some people slowed earlier, others later. Evening did not require uniform participation. One person might still be active while another had already withdrawn. This difference did not create friction. It was expected. Because there was no evening program to follow, there was no pressure to arrive at rest together. Rest unfolded individually within a shared environment that was itself changing slowly. The absence of a defined evening slot removed urgency. There was no need to finish everything before a certain moment. Tasks ended when they reached sufficiency. What remained could wait without consequence. Waiting, already familiar, deepened here. People paused without anxiety. Sitting did not feel like stopping. It felt like settling. The body recognized the change without needing confirmation. Evening sounds did not disappear. They thinned. The density of activity reduced, but presence remained. A footstep here, a voice there. These sounds did not interrupt. They reassured. The environment became less directional. During the day, sound and light oriented movement outward. In the evening, they folded inward. Awareness narrowed naturally, not by force, but by comfort. This folding did not require withdrawal from the world. It allowed engagement to soften. Attention became less outward-facing. Thoughts slowed without needing to be controlled. Because evening was not defined as a block of time, it did not need to be filled. There was no expectation that something specific should happen. Nothing had to be accomplished. This lack of expectation supported rest long before sleep. The body did not hold itself ready for the next task. It allowed effort to drain away gradually. Even conversation adjusted, speech shortened, words carried less urgency. Silence appeared more frequently, not as absence, but as space between interactions. These pauses were not awkward, they were appropriate. The city itself mirrored this change. Streets remained present, but less central. Public spaces contracted, movement clustered closer to shelter. None of this required instruction. It emerged from repetition. Evening did not feel like crossing a boundary. It felt like arriving at a lower intensity. The same environment remained, but with fewer demands placed upon it. This continuity mattered because evening did not require a sudden shift. The nervous system did not brace. There was no abrupt loss of stimulation followed by emptiness. Everything softened together. As effort faded, the body did not need to decide to rest. Rest appeared naturally once effort was no longer required. This is a crucial distinction. Evening was not a command, it was a condition. The lack of a defined start meant the lack of pressure to use evening well. There was no sense that this time was special or limited. It did not need to be protected or maximized. Instead, evening belonged to the same continuum as the rest of the day. It was quieter but not separate, slower but not distinct. For that reason, the transition into night did not feel dramatic. Darkness did not arrive as an event. It gathered gradually, overlapping with light rather than replacing it. People adjusted to this overlap instinctively. Lamps appeared where needed, not to extend the day, but to soften its retreat. Light became localized, shadows deepened, space contracted gently. This contraction did not feel confining, it felt supportive. The environment offered fewer directions, fewer possibilities. The body welcomed this narrowing. Movement reduced without being restricted. People stayed closer to where they were. Distances shortened, actions simplified. Evening, in this sense, was not about stopping. It was about simplifying, removing layers of demand until only what was necessary remained. Because this process was gradual, it did not provoke resistance. There was no internal negotiation. The body followed the environment willingly. This willingness is what allowed evening to function as transition rather than block. It carried the day forward rather than cutting it off. As the last tasks were completed, nothing replaced them. Space opened, time loosened, awareness softened. Evening did not need to be recognized as such. It did not need a name. It announced itself through ease rather than signal, and because evening did not arrive at a number, it did not leave at one either. It dissolved slowly into night, just as it had emerged from day. There was no moment when one could say the day had ended, only a sense that effort had withdrawn far enough for rest to become possible. This is how evening lived in ancient Rome. Not as a slot to be filled, not as a phase to be entered, but as a gentle retreat of demand. The world did not stop, it simply asked less. And because it asked less, the body responded by holding less. Less tension, less attention, less readiness. Evening was not scheduled, it was felt. Because evening dissolved rather than ended, rest did not require a clear beginning. There was no moment when the body needed to confirm that it was time to sleep. No internal question had to be answered. No number had to be checked. Rest emerged as the natural continuation of a day that had already loosened its grip. The body did not wait for permission. It responded to conditions. Movement had slowed, demands had thinned, light had softened and then narrowed. Sound had reduced its range. These changes did not arrive suddenly. They accumulated quietly until effort no longer made sense to sustain. In this environment, the body began to lower itself without instruction. Muscles released not because they were told to, but because nothing required them to remain engaged. Posture softened, breath deepened. The nervous system did not switch modes, it eased. This easing mattered. When rest does not require a decision, it does not carry tension. There is no moment of resistance, no negotiation between what must be done and what can wait. The body does not brace against unfinished tasks, it simply settles where it is. Sleep, in this sense, was not an event that arrived. It was a condition that gradually became possible. Awareness thinned before consciousness withdrew. Attention loosened before thought dissolved. The body drifted rather than stopped. Because time was not tracked numerically, there was no sense of being early or late to rest. Sleep did not feel earned or overdue. It felt appropriate. It arrived when the environment could hold it. The absence of a known hour removed urgency. There was no pressure to fall asleep quickly, no fear of losing time. The body did not rush toward rest. It allowed rest to approach. This allowance changed the texture of sleep itself. Falling asleep did not feel like crossing a boundary. It felt like continuing a process that had already begun earlier in the evening. Night did not arrive by switching. It arrived by thinning. Activity reduced layer by layer. Light withdrew. Sound softened. Movement became minimal. Nothing disappeared all at once. This gradual thinning prevented shock. The nervous system did not experience contrast. Without sharp changes, there was nothing to react to. The body remained calm enough to release control. Inside this continuity, sleep did not need to defend itself against interruption. Small sounds, minor movements, distant presences did not register as threats. They belonged to the same stable environment that had carried the day. Because rest emerged within familiarity, the body did not monitor its surroundings actively. It trusted them. Trust allowed vigilance to fade without being forced. The mind did not need to empty itself. Thoughts slowed naturally as attention loosened. Ideas did not need to be pushed away. They lost their urgency on their own. This is an important distinction. Rest did not depend on silence, darkness, or isolation. It depended on predictability. The environment behaved as expected. Nothing changed suddenly. Nothing demanded response. When the body recognizes stability, it does not need to remain alert. It does not scan for danger. It does not prepare for action. It releases readiness gradually. In ancient Rome, this recognition was learned over time. The environment repeated itself. Nights followed days without disruption. Sound did not vanish. Light did not cut off abruptly. The world did not rearrange itself suddenly. Because of this repetition, the body learned that rest did not require withdrawal from the world. It could occur within it. Sleep arrived without needing to be protected. There was no expectation that night should be silent or complete. Partial presence was enough. A shared space, a familiar sound, a steady darkness. These conditions were sufficient. Rest did not demand perfection. It required only that nothing escalate. And nothing did, because time was not known as a number. It did not create pressure. The body did not calculate how much sleep was possible or remaining. It did not anticipate waking. It did not count. This absence of counting allowed sleep to deepen. Without anticipation, there was no internal tension pulling awareness forward. The body rested where it was. Even waking during the night did not disrupt this pattern. There was no clock to confirm interruption, no sense of being awake too early or too late. Wakefulness was simply another state that passed. Sleep returned when conditions allowed, without concern for duration. The body trusted that rest would complete itself. This trust is central. When rest is not measured, it does not become fragile. It does not need to be preserved carefully. It can be interrupted without collapsing. The Roman night did not demand stillness. It allowed it. And because it allowed, rather than required, stillness emerged naturally. As the night deepened, awareness thinned further. The body did not mark this deepening. It did not observe itself resting. It simply rested. There was no moment when time needed to be checked to confirm safety. The environment itself provided reassurance. Familiarity replaced certainty. By the time sleep fully arrived, time had already ceased to matter. The day had not ended, it had faded. This fading allowed the body to remain connected to its surroundings without remaining conscious of them. Sound, temperature, space, all continued, but without relevance. Sleep did not arrive because it was late. It arrived because effort had nowhere to go. And in this way, rest was not a reaction to time, it was a response to environment. The body rested because the world allowed it to. This is the final shape of living without clocks. Time did not need to be known for the body to rest. It did not need to be monitored or managed. Time did not interrupt life. It held it. Time had never been missing or unclear. It had simply not been separated from life. It moved through light, through work, through waiting, through shared space, and finally through rest, without ever needing to be named. Living without clocks did not mean living without order. It meant living with a different kind of coherence. The day did not fragment into segments that needed to be tracked. It remained whole. Morning did not demand recognition. Evening did not require announcement. Night did not arrive on command. Each phase emerged from the conditions that preceded it, and those conditions were visible, audible, and physical. Because time was not abstracted into numbers, it did not pull attention away from experience. The body did not stand outside the day to observe it. It remained inside it. Hunger, fatigue, warmth, light, and sound acted as signals that did not need interpretation. They did not instruct, they simply informed. The body responded without calculation. This responsiveness allowed the day to regulate itself. Work expanded and contracted naturally. Waiting did not feel empty. Rest did not feel earned. Shared life did not require synchronization. Each person moved within the same unfolding day without needing to occupy the same moment in the same way. Time accommodated variation without losing structure. Nothing about this required constant awareness. In fact, the absence of monitoring was what allowed the rhythm to hold. When time is not watched, it does not need to be defended. It does not become something that slips away. It becomes something that carries. This is what it meant for the day to explain itself. It did not need external confirmation. It did not need to be measured in order to be understood. Its shape was visible in the way light shifted, in the way effort softened, in the way rest arrived. The body learned this shape through repetition, not instruction. In ancient Rome, time was not an object to be consulted. It was an environment to be lived within. The day unfolded without labels, and because of that, it remained legible. Not precise, but sufficient. Not exact, but stable. In ancient Rome, the day did not need to be measured to be lived. It unfolded slowly, and it was understood simply by being inside it. Good night.